Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for being here. My Norwegian is non-existent, but everything that she said sounded amazing. So I appreciate this warm introduction. I'm excited to be here, and I know there's a public holiday coming up on Monday. So everybody who is here, I can see that's like a very positive selection of people who are highly interested in this topic. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania with a focus on understanding the relationship between social norms and all kinds of behaviors. So we do a lot of work understanding deviant behavior related to corruption, to lying behavior, all these type of things. But we just more generally try to understand the role that social norms play in explaining behaviors of all kinds. And so what I would like to do today is to guide you through a couple of approaches and ideas that we are investigating using different methods. I'm an experimentalist and an economist by training, but we use methods that are very diverse, and we borrow from psychology and philosophy and political science. And so we try to provide a very holistic account of what it means to have behavior and norms to be intertwined. So that's what I would like to do today. Now, before I get started, just to set the stage a little bit about the group that I'm part of. Christina Bicchieri, who is one of the eminent figures on the topic of social norms, is the director of a center on social norms and behavioral dynamics. And the center tries to collaborate with institutions, governments, companies around the world, and really trying to understand how to foster norms and the measurement of norms to make a positive change. And so we work on topics related to very problematic and challenging topics such as female genital cutting or child marriage. And so we are collaborating with institutions and companies and trying to bring our methods to the field, helping to change bad norms and trying to produce positive behavior change. Now, as a point of departure for today's talk, I think I don't need to convince anybody that social norms are really sort of the glue of the society. And what happens is that they are particularly important in environments in which we don't quite know what we should be doing. And so when we're uncertain, we're looking to others, we're looking to peers, we're looking to our networks or social networks. We try to understand what we should be doing, and that can be good and bad. And so one of the things that I will be showing you today is situations in which learning from others can produce positive change, but sometimes it produces also learning the bad behaviors, and we need to find ways to counteract that. Now, what the challenge is here is really to make sure that we can establish, promote, and sustain norms. And in a way, there are multiple challenges related to this. And the way I think about them is that the three steps that we want to take into consideration when we talk about norms is we have sort of the measurement stage. We want to understand what the environment is in which we operate before we intervene. Often this step is skipped and we just think about solutions to problems that we haven't yet identified. And so the measurement stage is actually quite important, and that's what our team at the University of Pennsylvania is really focused on, is using methods to understand the environment and really then know what the right kind of intervention should be. And then the second step is then the assessment of the right intervention, which of course is based on the problems that we identify in the first stage. And then the last one is sort of the preservation. Understanding how to, once you achieve behavior change, how to sustain this behavior change. Because often norms are very fragile. And unless we know how to actually make them sustainable, even the best positive change sort of decays quite quickly. Now, when we think about what can be done in terms of behavioral intervention, the word nudging and sort of this buzzword of behavioral interventions using nudges has been sort of exploding as a buzzword over the past decade or so. The challenge is, and I'm going to just briefly mention this, but then really focus on the actual research, is that we often find that interventions fail and they don't work as intended and sometimes even backfire. And that's particularly challenging and important then also to study for institutions, because sometimes we can have the well-intentioned sort of interventions and then they fail for reasons that we were not able to anticipate. So what we actually need to do as researchers and institutions is also do follow-up research to understand what actually went wrong, which is something that especially academics have not been really good at in the past. When you find something that doesn't work, we would often just move on to the next problem. And the reality is we need to understand why it didn't work in the first place. Now, when we look at what the literature tells us, we know that most interventions that rely on simple behavioral interventions, just changing a default option or providing norms or any kind of like simple interventions, we know that most of these are very, very short-lived. And that is a problem from a behavioral sort of science point of view, because what this actually suggests is that simple behavioral interventions are not really changing people's minds. All they do is to use shortcuts that make it easier for people to make the right decisions. But the moment you take this intervention away, people go back to behaving in the way they did before. And so that means we need to essentially to constantly intervene in people's lives. And that's where sort of the social norms approach that we are doing is a little bit separated from the typical nudging approach. Because at the end of the day, nudging is really about sort of individual change. It's about changing behavior at the individual level and making small adjustments. But norms are about collective change. And if we can really change people's perceptions of what's right and wrong, we don't potentially do not need to keep intervening in the same behaviors, but we can really change the way people perceive certain, what's right and wrong in certain environments. Now, more relevant sort of to you here in the audience are interventions that have been done also in the context of tax compliance. And here's one example at the top where intervention was very well informed by psychological science of using priming techniques, of getting people to think about not lying and honesty and all of these things. And so in Guatemala, when people were asked to fill out tax forms, sometimes you get this CAPTCHA request, so you need to verify that you're not a robot, so Google would do that with you all the time. They replace the CAPTCHAs with these words, these positively framed words of honesty and not, everything that points to not evading taxes and paying on time and all of that. And it's a team of star sort of academics that ran this intervention, and it had absolutely no effect on tax compliance, right? And so it's a good example of where we are well informed through what theory and existing research suggests should work, but then we try to apply this maybe in a different context with different norms, with different laws, with different cultural backgrounds, and then it fails. And it's important for us to do follow-up research to understand what is it about this setup that was so specific that failed in this context. Now, successful and lasting behavior change for that reason is very difficult. And so, and one of the reasons why it's difficult is because there's a tension between what's beneficial at the individual level and what's beneficial at the society collective level. And often the way we can think about this is that from an individual point of view, deviance is often enriching. It's beneficial from a monetary point of view, but it's harming at the collective level. So if you want people to change, then we want them to essentially be willing to give up their gains and give up money and give up any kinds of benefits that they received and think about the greater good. And you can imagine that this is quite challenging and also depends really on where you are in the society. And so that makes you more or less susceptible to nudge interventions. So the way I think about these challenges for this particular talk is that there are several challenges that arise with respect to norms in particular. And the first sort of challenge here is that often norms are not clearly defined. We operate in environments in which norms are sort of vague, and it's up to the people to fill them with meaning. And so that, of course, gives rise to self-serving interpretation of certain environments. And so if you don't want to do something, and there's no clear rule that you are aware of or that you want to make yourself aware of, so you avoid seeking information on purpose, you might be filling this void with something that is self-serving and helps you to justify your deviance. And I will show you some research that we have done to study this. The second challenge is that the wrong norms are in place. And so now we need to do something about wrong norms, and really changing wrong norms is challenging because they often tend to be sticky for the reasons that I just mentioned, because people are benefiting to a certain degree and you need to get them to give up on this benefit. The third is that even if we introduce the right norms, we often do not succeed in successfully enforcing the right norms in a sustainable way. And so then often, although you introduce the right norm, it would decay very quickly because there's not enough enforcement or successful enforcement in place. All right, so that's what I will sort of refer to as these three pillars of norm-related deviance. And the way we think about our research is that it helps to understand how to successfully identify these challenges, but also how to successfully design interventions that can help the good norms to thrive. So here's a little overview of research projects that I've been involved in personally that can be categorized into these three pillars. I will obviously for many reasons not go in detail through all of this research, but of course I'm happy to talk after the talk if you're interested in some of these. But I will give you tidbits, snippets from different insights from different papers and research projects, just to give you a flavor for what is the insight that we generate with experimental methods and often also theoretical methods, mathematical models and all of that to get at this question. So I will briefly mention the first paper that you see in the first column of Unclear norms. I will show you that in a second, of what happens when you are in an environment where you can decide what to believe to then justify subsequently deviant behavior. I will then also talk briefly about the second pillar, which is the existence and learning of bad norms. What happens in environments in which we observe peers and the peers operate in certain ways and we can learn behaviors from them? How does it really affect the sort of the development of and sustainability of bad norms and good norms in those dynamic environments? And then I will conclude or have a little bit of information for the third pillar, in which I will mention to you a new approach that we are investigating now, which is the idea of introducing a meta-nudging approach where we don't really target the people of interest, but we're targeting those people in the environment who have a power of enforcing norms in sort of a society, right? So we're not directly targeting individuals, but we're targeting sort of a level above and trying to get people to enforce the right norms in those environments, right? And I think the way I think about this visually is that all of this stands on a base, which is how does this all help policymakers? And how can policymakers find the right solutions? And so I will conclude this very brief talk by showing you something that we just published on understanding how do policymakers make the decisions of which interventions to select and how to implement them. All right, so let's start with the first pillar of norms are not clearly defined. The starting point for this research idea is that there's often this wiggle room that we can decide to define in any which way we want, just to avoid sort of dissonance. So we really maybe want to engage in deviant behavior, and so we're looking for justifications to feel better about ourselves. And that works, of course, better the more wiggle room there is. And so if you're in an environment where maybe you think your peers engage in a certain behavior, even if you don't know it, but if there's just enough uncertainty about what peers around you are doing, you can decide to use this uncertainty in a self-serving way to distort the beliefs. And so that's what we sort of do. But existing research on social norms, and those of you who work in this field or have read maybe seminal papers by Robert Cialdini or have read books in this environment, a lot of this research usually takes the stance of we provide people with clearly defined norms and we see and then we measure how they respond to that. So we tell people something about a subgroup or an environment, we tell them what people do, what people approve of doing, and then we test how people respond to that. But here we are taking a step back and we say, well, what happens in environments where you are not being exposed to information, but where you need to make sense of the environment in which you are, all right? And so the reality is that there is a lot of inherent sort of uncertainty. We know that people respond to norms, but how do people make sense and create their own norms in these uncertain environments is the question. And so that is this dilemma of choosing what you want to believe. And we refer, or the literature would refer to this as motivated reasoning. The idea of this paper actually came from an episode of the show Seinfeld. And I don't know how many of you have exposure to the show Seinfeld. I grew up watching the show, learning English that way. But there's a little clip that I want to show you that really embodies the main idea. And so that's why the title of this paper is in a way a homage to this little clip. So let me just play this here.
Jerry, just remember, it's not a lie if you believe it.
All right, so So this is exactly what we sort of take as a starting point, where in this particular case, Jerry is dating a police officer, and she asks him a question that he does not want to answer truthfully, and she doesn't believe him. So she says, next time we meet, you come to the police station, and I will attach it to a lie detector, and then we'll see whether you told me the truth or not. And so he tries to find ways to trick the lie detector. So he meets with his friend George, who is like a pathological liar, and he says, train me and teach me the art of lying. And he says, listen, I can't teach you that. This is something I've harnessed over decades of successful lying. And so as Jerry gets up and leaves, George has this very interesting line of, just remember, if you believe it, it's not a lie. And so maybe that's a way of tricking the detector. And that's the starting point. That's the setup for this experiment. So in this experiment, which is a quite simple experiment, participants were playing a task in which they were able to lie to us, essentially, as experimenters, and get more money if they lied. There was no punishment involved. It was just about an opportunity of lying. But what we varied across different interventions is whether at the time when we asked them certain questions, whether they knew that they themselves will be in a position of playing this game and lying. So sometimes they knew that they will be playing this game, and sometimes they did not know that they will be playing this game. But we always explained the game to them, and we always asked them to tell us what they believe other people are doing in a society, or people who played this game before them. So we asked the same question: tell us what you think other people are doing in this game. And we pay them money if they correctly predict what other people are doing in this game. But sometimes before they tell us what they believe, we tell them, well, by the way, after you tell us what you believe these other people are doing, after that you will yourself play this game. And what we anticipated using theoretical models and using existing evidence, we expected that if you can anticipate that you are in the position where you need to decide whether or not you want to lie as next, it will be much easier for you to justify your lying behavior if you voice beforehand that you believe the majority of the people around you is lying. You have no evidence that people around you are lying, but you need to make an educated guess. And so that's exactly what we sort of did in the experiment. That's exactly also what we find. So I'm going to just show you just something very simple in statistical terms. On the left-hand side is the belief elicitation. So this is how often people said that they believe the majority of other people lies. So what is the fraction of people saying that? And so the blue dots, 38%, is in a condition where people knew the game, but they did not know that they will be playing the game and be able to lie themselves later on. And so out of those, in that population, only 38% of the people told us that they believe most of these other people are lying. But in the condition on the left, the black dot, 62, this is essentially the same setup, with the only exception that as we asked them that question, we also told them, well, by the way, you will be playing this game yourself right after. And suddenly the same question yielded almost like a doubling. And now over 60% of our participants told us that they believed the majority of the people lied. And what you can see is that after they told us these beliefs, it also translates into higher cheating rates. So this is actual cheating behavior. And so you can see that the cheating rates between the blue and the black dot also double. So people who distorted their beliefs and telling us that they think the majority lied, they also had a much easier time to justify sort of lying subsequently. The paper does much more. It tries to get at the mechanisms and all of that, but this is really the main picture. If you get the opportunity to distort your beliefs, you can do this in a self-serving way, and then the same action becomes much easier because your past self has already justified your future self's deviance. All right, now, what does this mean for implications, right? This means that wiggle room often is quite problematic and challenging, and we need to pay attention to this when we provide information. If we try to close wiggle rooms, and we need to be careful, especially when we think about how to remove stickiness of existing bad norms. If there's too much wiggle room, people just choose to decide what they want to believe. They might choose to hate sort of, let's say, the political outgroup, although there's not a lot of evidence, just based on their belief that they think they hate them. We call this false polarization. And, all right, so what does this mean for policy? Sending clear, unambiguous messages, being clear about who the reference groups are that you're referring to, who are these people that are doing the right thing. You want to be specific about your messaging to make it stick. All right. The second pillar is the existing and learning of bad norms. And so what we do here with colleagues is that we try to understand in which situations do we learn which types of behaviors from other people. We are constantly exposed to different behaviors. We're constantly exposed to good behaviors that we observe and to bad behaviors that we observe. And so we need to often to decide which behavior to imitate. And so this paper is trying to, in this project, tries to disentangle the mechanisms that go into play as to when do we decide to imitate good behavior and when do we decide to imitate bad behavior. So there will be no uncertainty in this project. You will always observe behavior, but you can decide whether or not you want to follow this. And so, so evidence suggests that norms are followed and and the behavior is imitated, but we know very little how this changes over time and how norms sustain or decay over time. And that's something that we were interested in studying here. Now, the way this whole experiment works is participants are interacting with a charity, with a real charity, with real money, and they are partnered with a charity, and we pre-donate essentially money to a charity, and you as a participant have also money. And you can decide whether you leave this split, and it's always an equal split. The charity gets as much money as you can leave this as is. You can also decide to give some of your own money to the charity, and we donate that money to the charity. But you can also decide to take this money away from the charity, and you can decide to add this to your own account. And you can do that. There's no punishment. You might just feel a little bit iffy about this because we as experimenters might know this, but there's no repercussions of you doing that. So it's really your individual decision. Now, what we vary across different treatments is how much you know what other people around you are doing. And so we have this condition in which we tell you, we put you in a group. So after you made your first decision, we tell you, we put you in a group now. But it doesn't matter because you never observe anybody, but it feels like you are somehow part of a group. So we want to sort of keep the feeling of being a group constant, but you never observe anybody. You just do your thing and you do it for 20 periods. You do repeatedly these decisions of what you want to do with a charity and your own money. In another condition, and so I can sort of show you, so this graph, we call this observation condition. You observe people in your group. It's a small group of 4 people. You observe them and they observe you, and you know that. So, but you never interact with each other. You never talk to each other. You can never send messages to each other. You only observe people's behavior. But their behavior has no influence on you. They are playing their own game with their own charities. They're doing their own thing. And so now you observe what they do, and you can decide to imitate this or not. And then we have a condition which is called observation SP, social proximity, in which we test the idea that if we give you a little bit more information about these people, and we give you a little bit of information about common identities that you might share with these people, you might actually learn that behavior in different ways. And the way we do this here, we operationalize this in the US by using sports identities. And those of you who have ever visited the US or know about sports, you know the US is very sports crazy. So we tell people, we ask them a question about the Philadelphia team and how they performed. And then we, in these conditions, we then tell them, by the way, the people around you, they also answered, let's say, the questions in the same way as you did, or they answered the question a different way. So either they're fans of the same team or they're not fans of the same team. And so now we can play a little bit with identity. And we could show them it's the same behavior, but now it's somebody that you know a little bit more about. It's somebody who you probably refer to as your in-group in an identity space. Now, when we think about what happens over time, so this is normalized to the very first decision, okay? So they made a very first decision and then we group them. So we have a very first decision of these people. And so the level 0 essentially means that once they are in these groups for 20 periods, they take the same decision as they did when they were by themselves. Any positive value means that as they were in the groups, behavior started getting better, so they started to give more money to the charity. And any negative value will mean that they are starting to get worse in these groups and starting to take more money away than they did individually. So in the no observation condition, we find very stable behavior. People never observe each other, and so whatever they decided to do, they are just continuing doing over the next 20 periods. They never get any feedback, and that's important to know because there is literature that suggests a slippery slope effect in a way that once we engage in one bad behavior, it just goes downhill from there and just gets worse. At least in our context, we don't find evidence for this. People who decide to do something, they are very stable in their behaviors. But then in the observation condition, as we get to observe other people, things start to break down very, very quickly. So now people observe each other. There's a lot of heterogeneity here. Sometimes you observe a good guy. Sometimes you observe a bad guy. Sometimes it's something in between. But on average, behavior in these groups goes down much, much faster and to a much stronger degree than when they were individual and without seeing anybody. So it accelerates. But when we tell people the same information, but now they have this identity piece, they know something about the people, we see that this actually mutes the effect. And I will unpack this in a second for you. But the real reason why we find that this effect is muted is not so much that nobody is now imitating the bad behavior. They're still imitating the bad behavior. but now they're also imitating the good behavior. So when they're in the blue condition, when they just observe random people, nobody was willing to imitate the good behavior, because imitating good behavior meant giving away money that you could keep, and you would give it to the charity instead. Nobody wanted to imitate that. Everybody was like okay with not changing anything or imitating the bad behavior. Nobody cared about signals from around you if these people were unknown to you. But the moment we reduce this anonymity and we tell you who these people are in a certain arbitrary way of a sports identity, now people care not only about the bad behavior, but they also care about sustaining the good behavior. And so that on average sort of cancels out, and we see that the norm sustains, okay? And if we sort of do one more thing, it looks more complicated than it is. If we now break down sort of these treatments based on what these individuals did at the very beginning, before they joined the groups, before we exposed them to the groups, we have people who decided to give money to a charity, people who decided to keep the equal split between the charity themselves, or decided to take money away from the charity. That's the very first decision. So now we can look at who's actually contributing to this norm erosion. Is it the bad guys becoming worse? Or maybe we can turn some of the bad guys into good guys? Or is it the good guys who become worse, right? So now we can disentangle this from an experimental point of view. And what we find, and so I want you to focus sort of on the two right columns. What we find, if we look at sort of the difference, the gray account is sort of the blue one, sort of the blue area is what people did when they were by themselves. And the gray area is what they did once they saw the groups. And so what we see is a left shift. We see that initially good guys moved from giving about half of the money, about 50% of the money, to about zero. So the good guys became sort of worse, and they sort of contributed to the charities receiving less in this observation condition. But in the observation plus social proximity condition, we see that this effect is much smaller. We see that the proximity helps these people, these initially good people, to sustain the good norm and not be susceptible to sort of start taking all of the money. Okay, so that's what the identity does here. And it's the same effect for the initial, we call them abstainers. These are those people who didn't change the equal split between themselves and the charity. They decided fairness is fine. You have the same amount of money as I do. In the observation-only condition, as they start observing other people, they move from 0 to a negative 40 or so, right? So they start to become worse. But in a condition where they have some information about the environment, on average, we see that, again, the shift is muted. And so people are much less likely to go all the way to the negatives. Now, unfortunately, what we also see, and this is at the bottom, we see that the initially bad people are completely unsusceptible to any of this peer information. Right? So we see that they don't learn anything from others. They don't care about others. On average, they just decide to do the bad thing. And so that's the limit of peer pressure. That tells us that in order for us to change the bad people's behavior, we need to do a little bit more than just using peer pressure as a tool. We need to maybe enforce behavior, we need to punish and all of that. This is not something we have studied in this paper, but have studied in other papers. All right. Now, let me quickly mention the third pillar, and then I will sort of conclude on a policy note. We have, so this is now about how to enforce behavior successfully and how to change behavior using enforcement. And the motivation that we had in this paper is that we know that, as you just saw, that norms can erode quite quickly and peers can contribute to that. So maybe we can harness this for good as well. Maybe we can find a way that people are following the right rules from their peers, right? And so in reality, peers have this norm adherence function too, where if you decide to be very different from your friends, if you decide to do something that they really disapprove of, they will scold you, right? They will tell you that you're doing something wrong. They might ostracize you. So we all know of these social constructs where our peers are telling us what's okay to do and what's not okay to do. And so what we try to do here is sort of harness this existing social construct and find ways to maybe abstain from having governments and like tone from the top punishment, but really sort of use existing social structures to nudge and change people's behavior using sort of peer effects. So the idea, the way we introduced this here, we call this meta-nudging. Most nudging approaches target individuals directly. We want to change your behavior. We want you to save more. We want you to eat better and all of these things. Meta-nudging is sort of taking a step back and say, can we target those who are in the position of enforcing norms and who already have that power, and can we get those people to enforce norms to a better degree? And then we have also potentially, fewer problems of appreciating sort of the enforcement, as we, might have problems with governments enforcing certain rules if we don't trust the government. But here are social constructs where we already trust the people around us, so we might be more acceptable of that. The way we do this in this experiment is quite easy. We have a number of people doing a certain task, and the task is about deviance, it's about lying, it's about getting money for something that you shouldn't be getting. And then we have these other people who are evaluating the situation. We give them these situations and we tell them, tell us what you would do. Would you punish these people and to what degree? And we vary the scenarios. They have different lying scenarios, and sometimes lying is achieving a lot of inequality, so you get ahead by lying. Sometimes lying is achieving equality, so people are behind and they lie to sort of get to the level of other people. And so we vary all these things, but now what we are really interested in is, can we nudge these punishers to punish these behaviors in different ways? And the way we do that is quite easy. It's also something that many of you are doing in your research, is we give them information about norms. Sometimes we tell them nothing, and we just see what the punishment patterns are of these behaviors. And sometimes we tell them, listen, before you decide what you want to punish, other people have said that lying in this context is bad. In this particular context, the majority of the people said lying is inappropriate. Or we told them the majority of other people has not lied in this context. So if you're now going to see a liar, you're going to see that this particular liar is sort of in the minority. This person is not within the norm of honesty. And so we are sort of nudging these punishers. And what we find in this paper, and the paper has many findings and many different experiments, but one of the core findings is that relative to punishment behavior in this no information condition, we can actually increase the punishment behavior and norm enforcement of these people by providing these punishers with some norm-related information. And then for the same behaviors, they're now punishing more than they would have done without this information. All right. Now, let's think about the policymaker's perspective, which I'm sure is something that also you're particularly interested in. Like, what can policymakers do, but also, what can we as society do to improve interventions? So in a recent paper, my colleague and I sort of argued that for interventions to have bite and to really be effective, we need to ground them in research, for one that is very reliable. And as you know, many of you have a psychological background, or at least are familiar with sort of the problems or challenges that the academics have faced in the past. There's a lot of research out there that doesn't quite replicate to the degree that you want to. You think something is a good intervention, and then people come back and test the same interventions. They don't work anymore. So what we essentially argue are sort of three elements that we think help policymakers to make the right decisions. And I'm going to show you then one example that we've done ourselves. So the first one is something that we call a prediction market. The prediction market is the idea that some people are better at forecasting the effectiveness of interventions than others. That's something that we actually have tested, and I will show you the results in a second. If you ask a random sample of a population of whether an intervention works, potentially their ability of judging and forecasting the intervention and effectiveness of intervention might be quite different from somebody like yourself who's working in a certain field, who has experience, who has maybe behavioral science or a scientific background. This is an open question that we will also answer in our paper, but it's one of the recommendations that we make. I mean, in a way, this is foreshadowing that this is an approach that is helping using forecastings. And I will show you in a second how we did that and what the results were. The second one is so-called mega studies. So this is something new and was sort of pushed by my colleagues from Wharton. The idea is that you target one particular issue. Let's say the issue is how to get people to go to the gym more often, or how to get people to sign up for a vaccination. And now they are collecting ideas of interventions from 20, 30, 40 of the brightest minds in behavioral science. And they tell them, pitch an intervention that you would like to test. And so then they select 30 or so interventions, and then they test them on a humongous sample of hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes millions of people. And then they sort of create a horse race between different interventions within the same environment. And they can try to figure out which interventions work best. And of course, for that to work, you need very strong institutional settings and a lot of monetary support to do that. But in a way, you're not just putting all the sort of your eggs in the same basket of just doing one intervention, but you're really trying to test many interventions at once. And the third one is sort of meta-analytical evaluation. There's so much literature out there, too much to read. Any given day, thousands of papers are being published. So a lot of the contributions that people make are going unnoticed. So it's really important work that some people are doing is by trying to collect all of that research and trying to put it on equal footing and trying to look at, across all these different settings, did a certain intervention work? or did in the same setting different interventions work? And so you try to sort of create a database of interventions and really try to understand the meta-analytical effect of an intervention. And that really helps you then to figure out which intervention is more likely to succeed. Now, here's the paper, an example of the research that we've done that taps into the prediction market idea. In this particular research project, we partnered with the most well-known and largest behavioral science units in the world. Many of you might be familiar with the Behavioral Insights team in the UK, or that's where it started. And then also we partnered with Ideas 42, Center for Advanced Hindsight, and so on. And we had an experiment that was separate from this, a separate experiment in which we tried in the US to nudge Republicans and Democrats to wear masks more. And so we tested different interventions, and as we were still evaluating that data, we partnered with these institutions, and we tried to see, can they predict which of our original interventions will work in this particular very polarizing setting? And we compared their behavior to the prediction abilities of academics and to the prediction ability of lay people. Now, this is an important question because if you have acquired human capital and experience and working in policy, and you are not better at selecting what is actually working in these environments, then that is a problem in terms of wasting resources and money and time and all of that. So we were hoping, of course, to find that those who are most experienced are also the ones who can better predict what actually works in these environments. Now, what you can see from this figure is that this is actually true, luckily true. We can see that the prediction error of how far people's predictions are from reality, we see that the prediction error is extremely, extremely large for the lay people. It's all over the place. They saw that we explained to them the interventions, and they had to predict how effective these interventions will be. And they range from, not thinking it would have much an effect, closer to zero, to many of them thinking it will be a humongous effect and it will be super effective, and Republicans will start wearing masks more and whatnot. But then, as you go from left to right, you see that both practitioners, and that's who these people are in these units, and academics, that their prediction error is much lower. They're much closer to the truth than the lay people. So that's a good sign. Now, here's a caveat to this. The result from our experimental paper of trying to nudge people to wear masks, and we used many, many different interventions, not a single intervention actually worked. So we were not actually able to get people to wear masks more. And in the paper, we discussed the reasons for that. And one of the candidate explanations is that it's a very polarizing topic, and you can't just simply change the behavior of these people, especially in this closely knit social networks where people see each other, especially with something like a mask. And you can't just use simple interventions to get people to do something like that more easily. So the reason why practitioners and academics were much better at predicting this is that we're much more pessimistic about the effectiveness of nudging and behavioral interventions. So this could be also pointing to the idea that many practitioners don't actually believe that simple behavioral interventions, and we use state-of-the-art interventions, that they actually have a big effect in environments such as these. And so we need to understand much more about what it is about practitioners and academics. What is it about them being able to predict behavior much better than lay people? But I think this points in the right direction, which is if you have experience, why not leveraging the experience in this environment and trying to figure out which intervention do people collectively believe is the right intervention before you run it. All right, so let me conclude sort of on this slide. I think what's clear from our research, and something that I hope I was able sort of to convince you, is that when we try to understand how to change behavior, especially with respect to norms, there are many different challenges that are sort of intertwined, but we need to take care of in different ways. If there's ambiguity and uncertainty about norms, that's a very different a very different approach that we need to use than if we talk about how to enforce existing good norms or how to change bad norms and so on. So these are very different approaches. And so to achieve sort of successful behavior change, here are a couple of things that come out of this research. Right? So we want to examine and measure the environment, especially the polarizing environment in which we use these interventions. The more polarizing an environment is, the more challenging it is to use simple interventions to change people's behavior completely, because people have really strong beliefs, and it's much more difficult to make them change those beliefs. We need to test and retest interventions. Scaling is a challenge. Something that works in a small scale, in a small environment with a small survey, might not scale at all in a much broader sample. But even if you just go to a different city, if you go from Oslo to Bergen, maybe the same intervention doesn't work anymore because people just care about different things. But also the makeup of that society might just be different enough for that intervention not to work. And so we need to sort of harness behavioral science, as you just saw, to maybe then help select the right interventions. Often we have many, many approaches to tackle the same problem. We don't have enough time or money and resources to do that, so maybe we can use these prediction markets to actually select the right ones. And one thing that I'm personally passionate about that I hope to do more of in the future, and something that I encourage my students and to think about too, is just because something fails doesn't mean it has no informational value. It's actually very important to understand why interventions fail, because then we can avoid making these mistakes moving forward. And so we as academics especially need to do a much better job at publishing interventions that did not yield a successful behavior change, so that other institutions and academics don't waste their time and money in doing these interventions. So really drilling down on knowing why something didn't work is much more useful than just finding a null effect and moving on. And so I think for that, much more systemic change in academia also needs to be done, also in institution, to give people incentives to actually investigate why something didn't work. So with that, I would like to conclude. If you're interested in any of the work that I presented, here's a QR code that you can scan and check out the papers, but also my email is there. Happy to chat with anybody who's interested. So thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eugen. Very inspiring and engaging. Tax Norway also uses social norms, and I hope you have learned something new both about that and also the risks about using social norms. So firstly, I would just like to ask if there are any questions or comments to Eugen. Thomas?
Is there a microphone, or is this sufficient?
Just talk and I will repeat.
So thank you very much for this interesting but also bewildering presentation. For rational agent-minded people, this is extremely interesting. I was wondering, maybe you touched upon it, and I wasn't following that line, but I was. Could you say something a little bit more about the specifics of the interventions? What is the actual intervention?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, do you want to repeat? Is that?
Please. You can
Great. So, yeah. So I didn't touch upon this. So the way we did this in the original paper, we used interventions from existing theories that say Republicans and Democrats would respond to different types of messages differently. So, for example, if I focus you on your behavior, if you don't wear a mask, will have a big negative impact on the economy. We know from existing literature that Republicans and Democrats might respond differently to this focus on the economy. Other people might say, other messages included, you put other people in danger from a medical point of view, right? And we know that Republicans and Democrats have found to respond to this differently. So we use existing literature in sort of the political science sort of domain that has established different messaging techniques that tap into different perceptions of what's important to them. And we used 8 interventions that were messaging based, and we told people, we primed them in different ways. Essentially, these are priming techniques. And we expected that certain things should work differently. Now, what we found in that original paper is that there are level effects, as we expect in the US, that Republicans are much less likely to wear masks, and Democrats were already at the higher end of the distribution. But across these interventions, nobody really cared about any of the messages. They were just very firm in their belief what they wanted to do, and they were not willing. We had different ways in which we could measure behavior change and attitudinal change. We would ask people about whether they changed their attitudes towards masks, but we also would give them the opportunity to sign a pledge that they will wear masks more often, or that they would, we gave them an opportunity to publicly, like on Twitter and Facebook, to share this and like pledge publicly. So we had some behavioral measures and we had some perceptual measures. And we just find no effect at all. Nobody cared about any of this. They just had a very firm standing on this issue. And yeah.
Do you believe that it could be differences with respect
Yeah, yeah. So we also tested like a morally loaded message, like it's the morally sort of the right thing to do to wear a mask. We tried to do that. So we tried really different things. It just doesn't seem to work. And so what that suggests to us is if you actually want to change masculine behavior, you need to have actual enforcement and that's something that's much more tangible as a consequence, right? And so this was in a way a starting point for a lot of subsequent research that I've been involved in, trying to understand how existing polarization, especially of opinions, really renders interventions often completely ineffective because although it taps into your like cognitive laziness or something else, what these nudges sometimes do, it's completely overridden by the fact that you have a very strong opinion and I cannot just move you by sort of using this cognitive sort of element, right? Yeah.
Any other questions? No? Thank you very much, Eugen. I will now say something about Tax Norway's behavioral insights team, and
Thank you.
unfortunately it will be in Norwegian.